The Fayum, a natural depression southwest of Memphis fed by a channel from the Nile, was developed through irrigation projects into a rich agricultural region. Amenemhat III constructed a massive structure at Hawara that Greek visitors would later call the Labyrinth, describing it as exceeding even the pyramids in wonder, though unfortunately it has not survived. Foreign policy became more systematic. Lower Nubia was conquered and fortified. A series of massive mud brick fortresses were built along the Nile south of the First Cataract, imposing structures designed to control trade routes and prevent Nubian raids. These fortresses were engineering marvels in their own right, with thick walls, complex layouts, and defensive features that suggest military architecture was becoming a sophisticated discipline. Egypt was not content to remain isolated. It needed resources from the south, gold from Nubia, exotic goods from deeper into Africa, and it was willing to use military force to secure them. Trade networks extended north as well. Egyptian artifacts from this period have been found throughout Syria, Palestine, and the Levant. Egyptian literature references the rulers of foreign lands, local petty kings in these regions with whom Egypt maintained sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile relationships. Egypt was engaging with the wider Near Eastern world in ways it hadn't during the Old Kingdom, when the kingdom had been more insular, more convinced of its own unique centrality. But the Middle Kingdom, like the Old Kingdom before it, began to weaken. The 13th dynasty, following the 12th, saw a rapid succession of short-reigning pharaohs. The king lists from this period show pharaoh after pharaoh, each ruling only a few years before being replaced. This instability suggests political infighting, powerful factions at court competing for the throne, possibly weak hereditary claims creating opportunities for rival claimants. The central government's grip on the provinces was loosening again. Local officials were once more becoming semi-independent. Into this power vacuum came foreigners. The Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant, had been migrating into the eastern Nile Delta for generations, peacefully at first, settling in communities engaging in trade. But as Egyptian central authority weakened, the Hyksos increasingly asserted independence. Around 1750 years before the Common Era, they established their own dynasty, the 15th dynasty, ruling from their capital at Avaris in the Delta. For the first time in Egyptian history, significant portions of Egypt were under foreign rule. The Hyksos period, part of what Egyptians called the Second Intermediate Period, was another time of fragmentation. Native Egyptian dynasties continued to rule from Thebes in the south, but they controlled far less territory than their Middle Kingdom predecessors. The Hyksos dominated the north and much of Middle Egypt. Nubian kingdoms to the south took advantage of Egyptian weakness to reassert their independence and even raid Egyptian territory. Later, Egyptian historical memory would demonize the Hyksos, portraying them as barbaric invaders who destroyed temples and ruled tyrannically. In reality, the Hyksos adopted Egyptian culture quite thoroughly, used Egyptian royal titles, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own Semitic deities, and maintained Egyptian administrative practices. They were not destroyers of Egyptian civilization, but a foreign dynasty, ruling within Egyptian cultural frameworks. Nevertheless, their presence was intolerable to the Theban rulers in the south, who saw themselves as the legitimate pharaohs of all Egypt. Around 1700 years before the Common Era, the Thebans began a war of reunification. Seqenenre-Tao, a Theban king, began the conflict, and his mummy shows evidence of violent death, his skull bearing wounds from Hyksos-style battle axes. His son Kamose continued the war, driving north, recapturing Egyptian territory. But it was Kamose's younger brother, or possibly nephew, Ahmose who finally succeeded. Around 1550 years before the Common Era, Ahmose captured Avaris, expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, pursued them into southern Palestine to ensure they could not regroup, and once again unified Egypt under Theban rule. The new kingdom had begun, and Egypt would never be the same. The new kingdom lasting from approximately 1550 to 1077 years before the Common Era, represents Egypt at its most powerful, its most aggressive, its most imperial. The trauma of the Hyksos occupation had shattered the old Egyptian worldview. Egypt could no longer afford to be passive, relying on the desert and the sea to protect it. Egypt had to be proactive. Egypt had to control its neighbors before they could threaten it. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty launched repeated military campaigns into the Levant. Thutmose I campaigned all the way to the Euphrates River, setting up a victory stela to mark the northern extent of Egyptian power. His grandson Thutmose III, who would become known as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, conducted 17 campaigns into Syria-Palestine over 20 years, creating an Egyptian empire that stretched from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in Nubia to the Euphrates in Syria. The Battle of Megiddo, fought around 1457 years before the Common Era, shows how sophisticated Egyptian military organization had become. A coalition of Canaanite city-states, supported by the Kingdom of Mitanni, a Hurrian power in northern Mesopotamia, gathered at Megiddo to resist Egyptian expansion. Thutmose III faced a strategic choice. The direct route to Megiddo went through a narrow mountain pass where his army would be vulnerable to ambush. His generals advised taking a longer but safer route. Thutmose rejected this advice. He would take the dangerous direct route because the enemy would not expect it. The gamble worked. The Egyptian army passed through the narrow defile without being attacked. The enemy forces had positioned themselves to defend the other routes. When Thutmose's army emerged from the pass and arrayed for battle, the coalition forces were caught off guard, their defensive positions useless. The battle was decisive. The coalition army broke and fled back into the fortified city. Thutmose laid siege to Megiddo, eventually forcing its surrender. The captured city yielded incredible plunder, hundreds of chariots, thousands of weapons, and more importantly, the submission of Canaanite rulers who now acknowledged Egyptian overlordship. Egyptian imperialism was not like later European colonialism. Egypt did not generally replace local rulers or impose direct administration. Instead, local kings remained on their thrones but had to swear loyalty to Pharaoh, pay tribute, and provide military support when required. Egyptian officials, called messengers or envoys, traveled throughout the empire ensuring compliance. Local rulers sent their sons to be educated at the Egyptian court, where they learned Egyptian language and customs, and served as hostages to ensure their father's loyalty. When these sons eventually inherited their father's thrones, they were thoroughly Egyptianized, making Egyptian cultural hegemony self-perpetuating. The wealth flowing into Egypt from this empire was staggering. Gold from Nubia, where Egyptian control extended further south than ever before. Timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus and Sinai, tribute from Syrian cities, trade goods from across the Near East. Egypt in the New Kingdom became perhaps the wealthiest state in the world, and that wealth was displayed ostentatiously. The capital was moved from Memphis to Thebes in Upper Egypt, home of the dynasty that had expelled the Hyksos and reunified Egypt. Thebes became the greatest city in Egypt, probably in the world. On the east bank of the Nile, the temples of Karnak and Luxor grew through continuous construction by successive pharaohs, each adding pylons, courts, halls, and obelisks. The Temple of Karnak eventually became the largest religious structure ever built, a vast complex covering over 200 acres. On the west bank lay the Valley of the Kings, a desolate wadi where New Kingdom pharaohs cut their tombs deep into the living rock, abandoning the pyramid tradition for hidden underground sepulchres. This shift reflected both practical concerns about tomb robbery, which had become endemic, and changing religious ideas. The tomb didn't need to be visible, it just needed to be secure. The mortuary temples where offerings would be made to the deceased king's spirit were built separately, impressive structures along the edge of the desert. The wealth and power of New Kingdom Egypt is exemplified by Amenhotep III, who reigned around 1400 to 1362 years before the Common Era at the empire's zenith. Amenhotep inherited an empire at peace, secured by his predecessor's military campaigns. He conducted few military expeditions himself, instead focusing on diplomacy and monumental construction. His mortuary temple on the Theban West Bank was the largest ever built, though today only the two massive seated statues, the Colossi of Memnon, remain standing. He massively expanded the Temple of Karnak. He built a vast palace complex at Malkata. He married a commoner named Tieo as his great royal wife, a choice that broke with tradition but demonstrated that a confident pharaoh could do as he pleased. Amenhotep III conducted extensive diplomatic correspondence with other Near Eastern powers, and some of this correspondence has been preserved in the Amarna letters, diplomatic archives discovered at the short-lived capital of his son. These letters reveal a world where Egypt was one great power among several.